So it's a pleasure to have you, Bruce, today to talk about your books, your work, your research. And I would like to begin by asking you a short presentation of your work and who you are, what you are doing. Many people know you, but not everyone.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my books and my work. To give a little background, professionally, I do computer science, mostly artificial intelligence and robotics. And one of the things that did is it got me very interested in philosophy. What's knowledge? How do we know things? How does the mind work? And so forth. And so that, I'm not going to talk about that work particularly today, but that has provided a background for me. And really, like many people from childhood, I was very interested in the Greek myths. And as I got later, I got very interested in Greek civilization, the drama, philosophy, art, and so forth, poetry. And that later then developed into a commitment by me to Hellenic neopaganism or Hellenismos. And so that really was just another part of my life separate from my professional life. It's largely remained that as well. But as part of that, I was seeking various sorts of spiritual practices that would round out my life more. And I studied a number of Eastern systems, Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and Taoism and yoga. And I got a lot of worthwhile development, I think, from those. But I kept thinking, what about the West spiritual traditions? Why don't we find traditions like this in the West? And so I kept exploring that more, and that ultimately, let me back up and say that one of the things I think is important is that the spiritual traditions of different cultures are, they're adapted to those cultures. And so they tend to correct the imbalances that you find in each culture. And I think that Western culture is different from Eastern culture, at least historically. And so while the Eastern traditions are very valuable, they're not necessarily the best suited to the West. And so I thought, what are the traditions in the West that are better suited to us? And so because I was also interested in Hellenic neopaganism, that led me back to the philosophical traditions in the West, and in particular in Greece. And so that was really the origin of this long process of studying the roots of our Western philosophical and spiritual traditions, and also using them as a practice, an active spiritual practice, not just a theoretical topic.
I have two questions, listening what you are explaining right now. Why do you think that there is this difficulty for everyone to understand that this tradition, this Hellenistic tradition, philosophy and so on, is so complicated to find? It seems that this tradition disappeared. We are talking about Theurgy, about Hermeticism. Of course, we have texts, we have many things, but many things disappear through time. So why this disconnection between the past and today, and how we can build from that? Because Hypatia, yes, has been a very famous figure, but we have almost nothing from her.
Right.
So how we can reconstruct, is it possible, and why everything disappeared?
Well, I think one of the primary reasons so much has disappeared, of course, is that when Christianity came to dominate the Roman Empire, there was an active attempt at repressing and destroying, in fact, the earlier pagan cultures. So books were destroyed, temples were destroyed, and what in many cases could not be destroyed, some of the religious practices and some of the spiritual practices, instead were co-opted. So they were absorbed into the religious practices of the early Christian church and Christianized in one way or another. So I think that part of it was an active attempt at suppression, because the older pagan religion was viewed as a significant competitor. And then part of it is that the information is there, but it's just covered over by a thicker or thinner veneer of Christianity in many cases. And so, but I think that's valuable, because, when this happened, the pagan philosophy did not disappear. It was absorbed. It had an enormous influence not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East, in Egypt, and in other places around the Mediterranean. And so many of the ideas were absorbed into the other traditions, the Jewish mystical tradition, the early Islamic mystical traditions, and so forth. And so we can recover some of this. If we learn to look with clear enough eyes, we can see through these overlays, and by comparison between the traditions and going back to the pagan sources, we can often reconstruct it. So I do consider it to be it's a ongoing process, and it's a combination of reading the texts. And of course, one problem is that, and I'll talk about this also, why this is, but many of these texts have not been translated to English until recently, and some not yet. So sometimes it's hard to get at the original source material. And so it's a combination of taking the source material, understanding what they're saying, and then also using comparative information, both within the Western tradition and also the Eastern traditions too, because I think at root, these theurgic techniques are common across the globe. The other thing is there has been certainly a bias within Western academia, that a lot of these practices were seen as religious or mystical or magical, and for that reason disreputable. And so that caused a distortion within the academic community too, to kind of discount that stuff, to not talk about it, to explain it away, and to try and make the ancient philosophical practices appear more rational and more scientific in a modern sense than they actually were. And that's been a practice really in Western philosophy and Western academic philosophy since at least the Enlightenment, and really continuing up into the 20th century. And I think one of the important advances in the modern study of ancient philosophy, in particular Neoplatonism, is the recognition that these ancient philosophies were spiritual practices, and they don't fit our narrow notions of rationality and empirical science and things like that. And so, the more recent generations of academic scholars, I think, have understand this, and that's very valuable. So that's another important source nowadays, is that the work that's being done now can actually contribute to these as practical spiritual practices.
Well, you said that these philosophies and practices and so on has been absorbed by Christianity and Judaism and so on. This is sometimes difficult to say that these traditions became Christianity or Judaism and so on, or has been absorbed and twisted in some way in order to validate another kind of theology, another kind of way to see the world. So people who were not philosophers, who were not theologians, used this wisdom for their profit and to spread the new way to see the world, a new way of life. So this is not, I think, a kind of progress, because you said reconstruct from. That means we have now a religious system, which is Christian or Judaism and so on, who used these parts of philosophy, and you are trying to recover these parts and to recreate what has been destroyed or hidden. Is it something you are doing? This is in this way you are working?
Yes, that's exactly it. So the texts that we have, the surviving texts, are not complete, especially in terms of practice. They tend to be more theoretical. So that's important because they give you the theoretical background that helps you to understand why the practices are what they are. But a lot of this was passed down orally, and those oral traditions, in many cases, have been broken or weakened and distorted through the centuries. And so I think that's why we have to bring additional information to it as well and try and fill in the gaps.
So why choosing Hypatia?
Oh, so I've chose her for several reasons. One is that she is arguably one of the most famous female philosophers in a very male-dominated history, and certainly perhaps the most important ancient female philosopher. And so I thought it was important to acknowledge that female philosophers were very important, in particular in the Neoplatonic tradition that I wanted to talk about. And she's not the only one. There are others, of course, too, but she's perhaps the most famous. A second reason was that she does reflect the phase in Neoplatonism and the development of Neoplatonism, or I should say the phase in the development of the whole Platonic tradition that I think is most valuable to us today. And I'll say a few words in a minute about how we can try and understand what she might have taught. But the other reason is that she taught in Alexandria. And Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city. She had pagan students, she had Christian students, and she had Jewish students. And so I think this shows that Neoplatonism is a very tolerant philosophy. And in fact, it can accommodate many different religions. Arguably, it fits best in its original its original pagan context. But I think it shows that it can accommodate these other traditions as well. So I think that's a good sample for our time. We've got so much religious strife in the world, and the fact that she welcomed students from all of these different religions, and that she was a figure of tolerance, and that they all apparently went away. We know mostly about her student Synesius, who became a Christian, but who always stayed devoted to Hypatia. I think it's a good example, and I thought she was in that sense a good example. Some of the other famous Neoplatonists had more of a contentious relationship with Christianity, and that's important too. But I think, that Hypatia provides a good example for us as well.
But the tolerance and eventually for her, the end has not been very good, even for someone tolerant as she was.
That's right. So, and just in case some viewers don't know this, one of the reasons she's so famous is because she was murdered in a very horrible way by a Christian mob in 415 CE. And current scholarship thinks that it was partly because she was a pagan and that was used against her. But it was also, she was really just stuck in the middle of a political controversy, really between two Christian factions. The faction of Orestes, the governor of Alexandria, and Cyril, the bishop. of Alexandria. And so it was really two Christian factions, and she was more allied with Orestes because she was a figure of culture in the city. She was educated, she was well-spoken, people flocked to her lectures, and she was therefore also a advisor to the governor. And so she was seen more on his side, and Cyril stirred up this mob to kill her.
So she taught philosophy, yes, but she was not just teaching philosophy. She was also maybe teaching mathematics, physics, and so on.
Yes, so that's an important point about philosophy at this time, and for much of the ancient world, is it wasn't a relatively specialized academic discipline as it is now. Philosophy was, how do you live your life? How do you pursue or love Sophia, wisdom? And so part of that is very practical. You know, not only how do you live your life, but how do you govern a state if that's what your role is. And part of philosophy also is to understand the cosmos, the universe, and use that as a guide for how you live your life. And so astronomy and mathematics and other scientific disciplines, as they were understood at that time, were also a part of her teaching and a part of her study. So yes, what survives of her writings, in fact, is some mathematical work she did. She was arguably, she did some of the first programming. She developed some algorithms for doing arithmetic to improve the ability to do astronomical calculations. And so that's perhaps the only writing that we are sure is by her. There's some other work she edited with her father, who was also a philosopher and astronomer, and she apparently helped him edit those works as well. So so very much of a Renaissance woman, if I can put it that way, a little anachronistically. But you know, in that sense, she was reflecting very much the notion of philosophy at that time. It was not a narrow discipline. It encompassed everything from the physical world, psychology, religion, spiritual practices, and practical things too. You know, Plato, of course, advised rulers as well. So this was certainly part of the Platonic tradition as well.
Yeah, it was one of the main points to try to influence the head of states, and for Plato, it was the case. Yes. And what is the part of imagination in your book related to Hypatia? Because of course, you are explaining a very specific system, and we will talk about that in a few minutes. But as we have so few things related to Hypatia, what is the part of imagination?
Well, I think we have so few things, but we can triangulate. So one of the things that's stated about her is that she taught the philosophy of Plato and Plotinus. And of course, we have a lot of works surviving from both Plato and Plotinus. Also, a second thing we know about her, which at first seems like maybe it's a negative, but it doesn't seem like she was a philosophical innovator. So she didn't change much of the philosophy. She didn't introduce any radically new ideas or new directions in Platonism. And so what that means is that we can look at contemporary Platonists, Platonists that lived a little before her, Platonists that lived a little bit after her, look at their philosophy, and by essentially looking at what's in common between them, and also what we know about Alexandrian Platonism in that period, we can put it all together, and I think get a pretty accurate picture, at least in broad strokes, of what she was teaching. Mm-hmm. So, you know, what I'm teaching in the book, in the Wisdom of Hypatia, is practical spiritual practices, things to help people live a better life. And for that, you certainly need to understand some of the Platonic philosophy, but not all of its fine points, about which the Platonists disagreed anyway. So some viewers may be familiar with the philosophy of Proclus. Very elaborate theological systems he developed. A lot of it, I think, is really irrelevant to Platonism as a spiritual practice. And so in many cases, I go back to the simpler systems that Plotinus described. And so at the level that I think is appropriate for most people as part of their spiritual practice, there's not that much difference between Plotinus on one side, Iamblichus and Proclus on the other side, and Porphyry, and Heracles, who was a younger contemporary of Hypatia. He probably heard Hypatia speak. I would be very surprised if he didn't, since he lived in Alexandria. And
you said that in the book you are presenting the 3 degrees of wisdom with Epicurus, Stoicism, and Platonism, and so on.
Yes.
I was surprised in a way because, yes, we can use from these 3 systems few things that are very useful and eternal. Mm-hmm. So yes, but in the same time, this is opposite sometimes. Mm-hmm. Philosophy were different. The teachers were different. They were not located at the same time in different periods. So how you can reconcile philosophies which are different and maybe sometimes explaining different things?
Right. So that's a good question. There's really sort of 2 issues involved. One is that my focus is on practices, spiritual practices, as opposed to the metaphysics or the cosmology of these different philosophies. And the interesting thing is, when you leave aside the more theoretical or the more metaphysical aspects of the philosophies, they have a lot more in common. Now, as competitors, they often exaggerated the differences. But as nowadays also we often find that the philosophies that are closest together are the ones that fight the most, because they're trying to make clear that there's some distinction. Don't go to that guy, come here and learn from us. And these were very much in the ancient world. They were in competition with each other. They were looking for students. That's how they survived.
In a few examples, for example, you have to enjoy the life, mm-hmm. To be able to be focused on the present. Epicureanism is talking about that very clearly. Or you have to focus on the afterlife and mm-hmm. learn how to die well. Mm-hmm. And that seems opposite to me, or that can be seen as opposite. So on very specific points like that, how you connect?
Okay, so this is I think a very important point. So one thing I found, and you may have observed this too, that often when people get involved with theurgy, they kind of go off the rails. That they I think it's important, and I think most spiritual traditions acknowledge this, that it's important to kind of have your everyday life, your earthly life or mundane life, kind of in order before you start engaging in more advanced spiritual practices like theurgy. And I really believe that's true. And this is why, in some traditions, you shouldn't practice theurgy till you're at least 40 years old. And the idea is you've spent the first 40 years of your life kind of getting established on this earth, so you're well-grounded here before you start trying to leave it.
I heard several times this statement, but in the same time, you can spend your whole life to find your basis, and maybe 40 years is not enough, maybe 50, and you die before to begin anything. So
this is the point, you see, I think is, and I started originally just writing a book of Neoplatonism, and I realized that many of the spiritual practices kind of assume that you're already a practicing Stoic. So by the time of Hypatia, Stoicism had kind of been absorbed as just the common philosophy of everyone in the Roman Empire. And so people coming to Hypatia to study Neoplatonism and theurgy would already have adopted a Stoic way of life and many of the Stoic spiritual practices.
And so you're talking about Stoicism. Platonism, we know that Plato is the founder of Platonism. The same for Epicurus. But about Stoicism, who is...
Zeno, for example, or Epictetus would be two examples, and much better known, I think, to most viewers would be Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. This was a very highly developed, and I think a very good philosophical system. But it only goes so far. It does not teach any sort of theurgic practices. That was not part of it.
I read several times that we have nothing to be sure that Hypatia was teaching theurgy. Philosophy, mathematics, physics, yes. But what about theurgy? How we can be sure or know something about it?
Well, we can't be sure, but we can infer it. There's probably two kinds of evidence. One is we have some textual evidence that suggests that her father was practicing theurgy. Okay. And so, she probably was brought up involved in theurgic practices. And so, unless she explicitly rejected them, it would be, might expect that she would continue them as well. The second reason is we know primarily from the letters of Synesius that when he was writing to other people about what they had learned from Hypatia or about their experiences with Hypatia, he used Greek words which are used for the Greek mysteries. So the terminology he was using was very much what would be used for the mysteries or for these type of theurgical rituals. Now, so that was his vocabulary, especially his vocabulary when talking about Hypatia. So it's indirect evidence.
When you talk about Hypatia, and this is the path of wisdom, mm-hmm. And in a section of the book, seems that you oppose this path of wisdom to initiation, saying that in initiation there are 3 degrees: purification, illumination, revelation. And these 3 degrees, how you connect the path of the initiation and the path of wisdom. These 2 paths should be together in order to be very well balanced in the practice, or one should precede the second. What is the connection between initiation and wisdom?
Well, I think, I described 3 paths of ascent. Right, the path of wisdom, the path of love, and the path of trust, or the theurgical path. And all of them progress through those same 3 stages of purification, illumination, and then revelation, or unification, or perfection, the last stage is sometimes called. And this is all based on or patterned after the Eleusinian mysteries. So the purification phase largely focuses on the level of the soul, and we haven't talked too much about Platonic metaphysics, but the soul has to do with our minds in space and time, and our minds animating our bodies, and so at that level, this is really what you might call more the level of conventional ethics or morality, becoming a better person. And part of that is thinking, too. Thinking takes place in time. And so that's a lot of the more intellectual activities take place at this level of the soul. Because the reasoning mind, discursive reason, is at the level of the soul, because it's a sequential process.
I was about to ask something about that, because the location of the soul could be seen differently in the in the Eastern tradition, in the Western tradition. And when we are practicing philosophy, we are using our mind. Mm-hmm. And you say that we are using our soul, or is it the same?
We are using our soul. Yes, the mind is a part of the soul. From this Neoplatonic perspective, the mind, the discursive mind, the reasoning mind.
When I will die, I will lose my brain, so I will lose my mind, so I have no soul after death.
Well, so that's a matter of disagreement in the Neoplatonic tradition. Is how separable is the soul from the body? does the soul, for example, have its own immaterial body that it resides in, that is also connected with our physical body? And personally, I kind of defer judgment on that. And in particular, the Platonists have, some of them say that something like our memory and our personality survives. Some of them say that doesn't survive, that there's something much more abstract that survives, and I don't know the answer to that.
But the founder, Socrates, through the books of Plato, is very clear about metempsychosis, reincarnation. There is no doubt for the founder of the tradition.
Well, that's right. But, as near as we can tell, in many of the dialogues, you're left kind of in a state of doubt at the end about exactly what their opinion was. And certainly later in the tradition, there was debate, for example, could there be transmigration to an animal body? Some of them said yes. Some of them said no.
Yes. So in this case, we should avoid eating any animals.
Yes, exactly.
This is strange because sometimes in the part of the book you are talking about Neoplatonism, saying that this is very well compatible with atheism.
Oh.
So how you can say that, and in the same time saying we are working to improve our soul?
Well, so that's a good question. Let me back up a little bit and talk about what I think is an important part of the role of theory in all of this. So one of the important developments in ancient philosophy, in the study of ancient philosophy over the recent decades, has been this recognition that ancient philosophy was a way of life. It was primarily intended to help you live your life better. And so that involves a number of spiritual practices. I talk about a number of them in the book and have exercises for developing. Journaling, memorization of maxims or aphorisms, various sorts of visualizations. You asked about imagination. That's very important.
I want to come back after on that.
Okay.
Memorization.
But I think one of the things that's we're also beginning to understand is the role of the theoretical discourses, the cosmology, describing the structure of the universe and the soul and how the gods relate to it, that these were all intended to serve purposes, to support spiritual practices. So they were models to help you keep with those practices. So if you're in a difficult situation, you might remember a particular doctrine of your philosophy and kind of quickly run through it and remind yourself what you were supposed to do in this situation or what would be the best way to act. And so I think it's much better to view the doctrines of the various philosophers as a kind of verbal medicine, talk therapy in the literal sense, that and each student who would come to a philosopher, because we have to think about ancient philosophy, again, much more like an Eastern guru tradition, where you've got a teacher, and maybe a dozen or so students that are coming. They're discussing a text, perhaps, of the founder of the philosophy. They're maybe doing something that we might call group therapy, and then there would be individual meetings with the teacher where they would discuss their progress and be given practices and so on. And so if a student were having a particular problem, perhaps, or having some questions, the teacher would give them a doctrine which would be a kind of verbal medicine to help them either through that situation or to take a step to the next level of their spiritual progress. So
but
I think
in this case, you have the teacher. What could be challenging is to use a maxim, a part of a doctrine, to memorize this and use it. But this is not always easy to understand, even if the words are simple. Maybe they can be seen out of context and opposite to what the philosopher was trying to express. So we can see that every time on Facebook, people uploading quotations, posting many things, and sometimes the quotations are wrong. Yes, I think, such as you, that this is very important to memorize very clear and powerful words. And with the power of this heritage and time, but how can you be sure that the meaning you place in this quotation is correct regarding the philosophy, the world philosophy?
Well, I think, of course, what I've tried to do in the book certainly is not change the meaning of these particular phrases. So I've taken them, if they're out of some larger text, I've tried to, be clear what the meaning is. And so they are, in that sense, intended to be a summary, a reminder of something that you already know or have learned. So I hope I've done that.
What could be your advice for someone reading your book and eager to go further and learn a few maxims to avoid this challenge? That means someone. What could be the best advice for that?
Well, of course, I would say read the book. Don't just open it up and.
Of the philosophers.
Oh well, so what I've attempted to write, and I say this is I'm not attempting to write a history of philosophy. I couldn't do it in that amount of space, and there's lots of better qualified people to do that and who have done that. So the focus is on practices that will help people in their life. But I would say, I don't think it would be a good idea to just sort of pick these maxims at random out of the book, because you probably would be misinterpreting them or interpreting them in a more shallow way. So the rest of the book hopefully explains it better. And of course, I do give citations for everything. So for people that say, wait a minute, did Plato or Seneca really say that? You can check it out and you can read the context and see if he or she did. But the other thing is that what I've tried to do is in a sense mimic the ancient philosophers and give a series of stages. This is why I have these 3 degrees. And the idea is that just like if you're studying science nowadays, you might study Newtonian mechanics, and you would learn about how the motion of bodies and energy and things like that in Newtonian mechanics. Well, we know that theory is not correct now. It's a first approximation. But we don't start, elementary school children on quantum mechanics. They don't have the tools to understand it. And it would probably just, well, maybe we will, but I think part of the problem is that the Newtonian mechanics provides a good basis for that. And trying to teach them quantum mechanics directly might actually mislead them. And so I think this is important. This is why I go through these degrees of wisdom.
And you are highlighting that this is all about practice, and this is the core of the book, but the practice cannot be limited to 9 months.
Yes, that's right. So I do give a 9-month outline of how to do that. But, on the one hand, for many people, this is a lifelong practice. For other people, we didn't talk too much about the Epicureanism. The reason that's in there is because, again, it's actually the practices are quite consistent with Stoicism. The cosmology is different, but the practices at a very concrete level are quite consistent. They just don't go far enough. See, that's the problem. But many people still need that lesson, especially many modern people, especially many people in the United States are very materialistic. And what Epicureanism does, surprisingly to many people who only know the name, is it teaches you to limit your desires, to understand what is most important for having happiness. And usually that means having less rather than more.
But the point is to limit the desire or to select which one we have to use for our own development.
Well, it's to understand the real source of your happiness. And so, for example, Epicureans distinguish various sorts of desires. The first sort is natural and necessary desires. So that would be food and water, for example, and shelter. Then they talk about natural but unnecessary desires. So these are things that are natural to a human being, but are not necessary. And then finally, there are the unnatural, or non-natural is a better way to describe it, non-natural desires, things that are not inherent in being a human being. And the Epicureans don't say you should deny any of those desires, but obviously your priority should be on the natural necessary desires. And they say those are actually relatively easy to satisfy because it's really just sort of basic survival.
Knowing that is very, very useful and important, but knowing that doesn't mean you succeed to do that.
Well, so that's the practice. It's something you have to work at. And some people have, in a sense, know that lesson and are living at a sort of an Epicurean lifestyle already. And I would say, well, they can just kind of skip that part of the book, and maybe pick up a few interesting ideas, but move on. For many people in our culture, I think that's a very hard lesson because they do think that happiness comes with having more stuff and having more expensive stuff. And so I think the Epicureans have a very important lesson for them. So that's why I started with that.
And the position related to God or gods are very different for Epicurus and Plato.
Right. Yeah, and so really the main lesson I think the Epicureans have is that by most conceptions of the gods, they're blessed beings, and they're really not the sort of things that are going to get angry at us, that are going to be insulted if we laugh at them, or that are going to punish us for using their name in vain and things like that. And so it's really a way of, again, saying, if you have the right perspective on the gods, you won't fear them. And for many people in the ancient world, and certainly in our world as well, religion is one of the things that doesn't help their happiness, but actually destroys their happiness. And again, that was important for the Epicureans, is to say, if you have the right attitude and you understand that, you will see that you have nothing to fear from the gods, at least at that level.
So how you connect religion and the religious practice and this philosophical practice? Is there any connection? Which one?
There's very little. Yeah, so I think, you see this, I would say that the Epicureans are mostly focused on how to live happily in a strictly mundane way on this earth, and basically ignoring the gods. The Stoics take this a step further, though, because an Epicurean would be very happy to stay at home, talk to their friends, have, adequate food and drink and shelter and live in sort of happy isolation. Stoicism goes a level beyond that, though, and it recognizes humankind as essentially an interconnected whole. And so what we do as individuals affects what goes on for all people. And so Stoicism has more of an obligation for social engagement, for having some impact on the world. Now, still, the connection with the gods is relatively small. It's really mostly just this view that there is sort of a unifying logos or principle or providence that governs the universe. But that's important. And so this is why we have a figure like Marcus Aurelius, who wanted to be a philosopher, basically, but understood that his role was to be emperor of the Roman Empire, and did a good job of it. A very, very one of the good emperors, as we call them. But it's still not very much involved at a spiritual level. There's not much engagement with the gods. And so this is where the third degree of wisdom comes from with Neoplatonism, where we say, okay, if we really want to do this well, if we want to live a truly meaningful life, it's not just being happy because we understand, the small number of things that's really required for our happiness. It's not just because, well, what Stoicism teaches us, what are our true sources of freedom and how we can be truly free in our lives while being engaged in the larger life. Neoplatonism goes beyond this and says, okay, how can we get divine guidance? How can we more actively participate in the divine governance of the world. And the Theurgy, of course, is the principal means of doing this. That is the mechanism that allows us to get in contact with the gods and engage with them directly.
There is a confusion very, very frequently between religion, philosophy, and theurgy. Some people are practicing theurgy as if this is a religion. Mm-hmm. Others don't know where to put philosophy and this kind of practice. So how you can clearly explain the difference, if there is any, between religion, philosophy, theurgy? Or if there is no difference, okay.
Well, no, I think there's definitely differences. So on the one hand, I will set aside modern academic philosophy, which is a quite different thing. Yes. So, and if we look at ancient philosophy, which again was a way of life, we can put it in the context of the ancient world. So in the ancient world, there were state religions. There were many shrines to individual gods and various divine beings all over the place. And most people had some sort of religious practice. They made offerings and sacrifices in their home. They did it in the town squares and at the temples. They did it by the roadside. There was a popular religion that almost everyone participated in to some level. Interestingly enough, belief was not an important part of the religion.
I was about to ask you that. There is, in this case, there is no belief per se. That means no dogmas. You have to believe in and follow, correct?
That's right. And so the important thing was that you honored the gods, and what you thought about them was really not, the gods didn't care about that. And so most people didn't care about it either. Of course, philosophers talked about it. They were what you might call the first theologians. Mm-hmm. But again, philosophy then was a way of life, and it was for people that were not satisfied with the popular religion. And so they would seek out philosophers. Again, if you think of a guru, that's kind of a good model. They would seek out individual teachers that they had heard were, very wise, and they would study with them. And again, not so much to learn some arcane theology or something, but to learn how to live better, to learn practices that would help them to live better. Now, what do you mean by live better? Well, that's how the philosophies differ. Epicurus would say, well, tranquility, for example.
But for some people, live better is now, and prepare our afterlife is different, and we need for that something maybe stronger, like school of mysteries, initiations, and so on. Is this the way to say that?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. So that was one avenue for people that wanted a religious experience beyond the popular religion, was to be initiated into the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, Orphic or Bacchic traditions, for example, were all ways of going beyond the popular religion and having a more intense and a more personal, I'll call it a religious or spiritual experience is probably a better way to put it.
Yeah, Apuleius is a good example for that.
Excuse me? Which?
Apuleius is a good example for that.
Yeah, so that's right. In the Golden Ass or the Metamorphoses, the initiation into the mysteries of Isis was a very, very nice example of how that goes. Of course, we don't really think he revealed any secrets, so it gives us something of the externals of the mysteries. And certainly those mysteries, the Eleusinian in particular, and the Orphic as well, gave people an experience of the afterlife that, from what we know of them, made people feel better about dying. We really don't know much about what went on in those. That information has been almost entirely lost.
If I may, I would like to say a few words about your latest book, The Oracle Apollo. And I have a few questions related to the book, of course, but can you explain to us how you You went from the Hypatia to the oracles. Is there a connection? Or what was the point of the latest one?
Well, so the oracles of Apollo, which I should explain, is written under the pen name John Opsopeus, which I use for my more strictly Hellenic neo-pagan writings. In some sense, it predates Hypatia, because back in the 1990s, I was looking for a divination system that was essentially in the Greek tradition. I had used other divination systems, tarot. In fact, I have a tarot deck that was published back in 2001, and I'd used the I Ching and runes and various sorts of divination systems, but none of them were Greek. And I thought, well, the Greeks we know did a lot of divination. So what were some of the techniques? And I found this alphabet oracle, which at that time had not been translated into English. So I translated it into English and put it on the web. And lots of people have used it over the years, and it's been quite successful. So in that sense, that long predates Hypatia and really my interest in Neoplatonism, for that matter. So I decided that I should go beyond what was on the website and actually publish an updated translation of this alphabet oracle with a lot of supporting material that helps people understand divination in the ancient world and understand this particular oracle and interpret it. And I also present a second oracle in the book as well, the Oracle of the Seven Sages.
And how you use this oracle? What is you? This is not cards. This is not.
Yes, that's right. So one of the interesting things about the alphabet oracle, it's obviously based on the Greek alphabet, and so it is in that sense similar to rune casting. But in contrast to rune casting, we have the key to the oracle because there are actual ancient stone tablets engraved with the meaning of each of the Greek letters in this oracular context. And in fact, there's about a dozen of these tablets survive, mostly from Turkey and mostly from the 2nd or 3rd century CE. And, the texts between them are quite consistent. They're not identical, but they're quite consistent. So in that sense, we have the actual oracle text. We know what each letter of the Greek alphabet meant in a divinatory context. What we don't have is instructions on how to cast the oracle. But it's pretty obvious that what the ancient Greeks did was somehow pick a letter of the Greek alphabet. Now, one way to do it would be to roll a 24-sided die. Yeah. Unfortunately, as far as I know, none of those survive. We have 20-sided dies engraved with the first 20 letters of the Greek alphabet, which doesn't seem suitable. But as far as I know, there are no 24-sided dies. And you'd think as many tablets are around, there would be, at least a collection of these in museums around the world. But we also know that in the ancient world, dice divination and divination with astragaloi, or the hucklebones of sheep usually, were very common methods of divination. And we also have surviving tablets that give the meanings of different throws of the dice or astragaloi. Okay. And so that kind of shows us how they did it, the order in which they put them and so forth. So what I do in the book is I suggest various ways of consulting the oracle. So you can use engraved stones. I've got a couple here I can show you if that's clear. This happens to be crystal. It's engraved with letters of the Greek alphabet, and so you can. That would be one way to consult it. And maybe this is what was done, but again, I don't know of a lot of stones like this that survive from the ancient world. And you would just draw one. You can actually nowadays get 24-sided die with the Greek alphabet. I don't know if I can find mine here quickly. Yeah, here. Oh no, that's not it. You can use astragaloi Here's actually an artificial astragalus. So you can get natural ones, or you can buy artificial ones.
Maybe natural ones are powerful.
Yeah. But, but we also know the ancients used artificial ones too. In fact, here is a lead astragalus from the ancient world. So they didn't always just use the natural ones. Here's a one made out of bone. You see, it's not very accurate, but so I think these are all authentic ways of doing it. Now the actual correspondence. So here's the 24-sided die. It's made by 3D printing. So it's got the Greek letters on it. You probably
and readers can find it somewhere?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually put some links to this on my website. I mean, you can Google it and find this stuff without too much trouble, but I think I'll put some links on it to help people. So I provide a variety of different techniques. I mean, we know the ancient Greeks used ordinary six-sided dice. They used astragaloi. They used beans or beads or stones.
I'm very curious. We can read a lot and learn a lot from the book, but I am very curious to connect divination, fate, and freedom. And how the ancient, and today you, can reconcile these two things, saying, okay, I can be free and choose freely what I will do tomorrow and after tomorrow. But in the same time, I can use an oracle which is able to give me advices or indications on my future. Is it opposite or not? That seems to me contradictory.
Right. So that's a good question. And of course, the ancients debated this issue as well. One of the writings we have from Heracles, the contemporary of Hypatia, is on fate. And the answer, I think, is it's really in the term divination. I mean, it has divinity as part of the word. In the ancient world, at least in the Neoplatonic tradition, divination was viewed as a kind of theurgy, a way of contacting the gods. So instead of engaging with a god directly and talking to them, it was a mediated form of communication with the god. The god was, in a sense, controlling the way the oracle fell and giving you a message that way. So, if you look at the oracles, I should say the alphabet oracle, it's geared towards practical advice. It sometimes says things like, don't go now, wait. Or it'll say, your project is going to work out okay. So these oracles were set up in town squares in many cases, or in roadside shrines. And so people that were, going somewhere on business or as students or whatever, they could get some advice on how their journey or their...
Yes, but when you do that, if I ask you, I have a decision to take and I don't know what to decide, so you give me an advice, but this advice will influence me in some way. So when I use the oracle, I am under the influence of the gods telling me, they are giving me their advice on telling me what to do. So if I want to keep my freedom, I have to avoid any oracle, or how you reconcile that?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you were trying to preserve your freedom at every step, yes, you might do that. But I think, first of all, I don't think you should consult an oracle frivolously. That you should be genuinely seeking some sort of advice. And if you can figure out the right answer without consulting the oracle, well, you probably should. So in some sense, you should be consulting the oracle where you're in a quandary. The other important thing, though, and this is pervasive in the ancient world, is that oracles are ambiguous, and you can read all of the stories about the oracle at Delphi. Yeah. And, a key part about consulting the gods through divination is the process of interpreting the oracle. And many people were led astray by interpreting the oracle incorrectly. And the Neoplatonists explained this. They said, that the gods are doing this because they want us to exercise our wits. They want us to think it through. And so that they're not completely determining. It is still on us. Here's a piece of advice. Think about what it means. Reach a conclusion. And in some sense, the idea is when you reach that conclusion and you declare, yes, this is what the oracle means. If there's anything that's determining your future, it's that.
So the best is to do that for us, not to ask to someone else to do the oracle for us.
I think so. You certainly, you can ask somebody's advice, but yeah, it really has to come from you, because the gods are speaking to you, and so they're speaking in language and symbols that you understand.
So if you are trying to contact the gods in some way, or daimonists, in order to receive this indication, you should be prepared to do that. Do you need a specific ritual before?
Yes, I give these in the book. They're mostly adapted from the Greek magical papyri, which is one of our main sources of actual rituals from the ancient world. A very mixed bag, of course, but there are good rituals in there. And so, yes, first of all, I think your divinatory tools, your lots, should be consecrated to that purpose. And so I give a consecration ritual, and that can be more or less elaborate. And of course, you can, if you have your own ritual, you can use that. But I've given these Greek rituals in case you don't. And then there's a ritual for divination itself. And so, in fact, there's two rituals. There's a fairly elaborate ritual, which you would do for a serious divination. And then there's a more abbreviated ritual if you didn't have the time or you weren't in a place where you could do a more serious ritual.
You are highlighting the connection between divination and gods. Does that mean gods are talking to us? That seems presumptuous for me, because if they are gods, they are not close to us. They have maybe something else to do.
Yes, that's right. Well, so it is based on an assumption. It comes out of the philosophy that the gods have some sort of providential interest in what's going on the earth. Now, that's not an Epicurean idea. That is more of a Stoic and a Neoplatonic idea. So, yeah, there is a presumption there that the gods have some providential concern for us. But the other issue is one that you alluded to before, that in fact, I think Neoplatonic theory really suggests to us that usually we're not communicating directly with the gods. We're communicating with daimonos, if you like, assistants of the gods that have more of an individual concern for us. They are, as opposed to the gods, they are in time and space. And another one of the kinds of daimonos are the angeloi, the angels. Angeloi means announcers or messengers.
We should understand that in the same way. They are identical.
Well, yes, I think they're identical. Some of the Neoplatonists would make distinctions among various classes of them, and the angeloi would be just one particular class. But I think for most moderns, they're essentially equivalent terms. It's not an important.
And for you, they are.
Yes, they are. These are the messengers of the gods. They're the intermediaries. And so if we're praying to a god, or if we're doing divination and communicating with a god, if we're doing a theurgical ritual even, where we're invoking a god, I think, in fact, and this is really my theological position, others would disagree, but I think, in fact, most of the time, we're speaking with a daimon that's in the lineage of that god. It's a emanation of that god. And that's, in fact, probably what we want, because as you said, the gods themselves are probably not so concerned about our individual lives.
So at the point when we are invoking a god, maybe it should be better to invoke just the daimon instead?
Well, maybe. I think, that when we invoke a god by the god's name and the god's symbols, that has the effect of calling the daimon. And unless we have a specific name or means of invoking the daimon, that's really the only way we've got to do it. Now, once you have contacted a god, or more likely a daimon, then part of the theurgical process is to arrange specific means of invocation, which might involve some other name or other symbols or other types of mechanisms that work specifically with that daimon. So, and that's I think, a very reasonable thing to do if you've got essentially an ongoing relationship with this daimon, is to establish a more direct communication channel. It's kind of like, you contact an organization and somebody in that organization sends you an email back, but now you have their email address, right? And you can contact them directly.
I want to be sure that everyone understands the difference. We are not talking about a demon.
Yes, certainly, that's true. Yeah, no, a daimon in ancient Greek was just an intermediate spirit between a god and humans, and so there was no notion that they were necessarily good or evil. And I think that's an important point. That the gods themselves, but also daimons, have their own agendas, and sometimes they align with our agendas, and sometimes they don't. And so,
but in the same time, the Neoplatonic tradition is always saying that gods, gods are good for us and are just seeking the best for us.
Right. But the good for us may not be so apparent sometimes. So, so you get sick, for example, and that may be the work of a god, and
it's not a revenge from them.
No, it's not revenge. It's not revenge.
Okay.
Revenge is, I think this, from Epicureanism up through Neoplatonism, revenge is not something, it would be insulting to consider a god vengeful.
Why?
Why? Because it's a human emotion, and it's really an emotion that we really don't think is very good with humans. We tend to think of vengeful people as not very nice people and a little bit out of control.
But when we read the life of gods and goddesses, this is your fight for desire.
Yeah. So that would be the difference between a kind of fundamentalist neo-paganism or Hellenic neo-paganism that would take all of the myths of the gods literally, and of course that would be difficult because they're contradictory, just like the Bible is self-contradictory. But that would be a sort of pagan fundamentalism, and certainly many people in the ancient world probably did take the myths quite literally. But the philosophical approach viewed the you could almost call them scriptures, the inspired writings of the ancients. So Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Hesiod's works, the Theogony and the works and days, they viewed them at multiple levels. They said, at one level, there's the concrete things that it's telling you about what this god did to that god, Saturn or Kronos ate his children, for example. Then there's an allegorical level where you understand that these gods represent different things, different principles, for example, in the universe, and that the actions have to be interpreted at an allegorical level. Beyond that, there's a symbolic level where these myths engage your soul, the symbols in your soul, and raise your soul up to towards the gods. And then above that, there is an anagogic level of where the myths actually work almost like a spell on you to bring you into contact with the gods. So, the literal meaning of the myths is just the most superficial level, and from the standpoint of the philosopher, it's the least interesting level. The real interesting point, and this would be conveyed, it is conveyed in written text, but it would also be conveyed orally, is how do we look beyond the literal meaning and look at the allegorical meaning and then the symbolic meaning, and then not even so much look and understand at the anagogic level, but experience the anagogic level. Let the myths operate on us like spells to bring us into contact with the gods. And so that's what would be taught.
We talked a lot about practice, and I asked you if you can give us a practice of your book to help us to feel really this experience, because the book is perfect, but we have to manage it alone. We have not you beside us to help.
Yeah.
In this case, we can. So maybe you chose some part of your book to do that?
Yes, I did. I've got an exercise from the book, and let me get a little water here.
Okay.
So this is a practice from the book. It's called the geocentric ascent. And I'd like to say a few words about, first of all, its purpose, and also maybe its context a little bit too. So we talked about the role of theory in Neoplatonism and in all of the ancient philosophies, that this was a way of supporting the spiritual practices. And so in particular, an understanding of the Neoplatonic worldview is important. And I teach this in the book. Basically, there's a notion of several planes of reality. There's the physical plane, the mundane world in which we live. There's the plane of the world soul, where the daimonists reside, and where, in fact, our souls also exist. And there's a level then of the world mind, or the nous, which stands for the intuiting mind that is in contact with the Platonic forms. And that's the level at which the gods reside. And then over all of this, there's a principle called the ineffable or inexpressible one, a principle of ultimate unity, beyond paradox, beyond contradiction, and so forth, which is the first principle, and it's associated in Platonism with the good. So that's, sort of a very quick outline of this multi-level view of the universe. But it's important then to experience it, to try and have a feel of what this multi-level world is actually about. And this exercise is an attempt to give an experience like this. It's a visualization that I'll give in a minute. But I did want to say one other thing about it. It's called the geocentric ascent and descent. And certainly we don't believe in a geocentric universe anymore. Our scientific view of the universe is, we're out in the suburbs of an ordinary galaxy and a kind of ordinary star and a planet circling that. And so you kind of have to forget about that, because from a psychological sense and a symbolic sense, we are at the center of the universe. And so that view is the basis for this exercise, and it certainly was the view for many of our ancient ancestors as well. But the point is, again, I'm not claiming the geocentric view is true. See, that's not the point. It's not what's true. What's the point is how does it operate? How does it work on your psyche? And that's the key idea here. So what I suggest you do, if you want to follow along with this exercise, is to close your eyes. And I'm not going to close mine because I have to pay attention here. And try and set aside everything else that's going on except for my voice. And first we'll do a few deep breaths to just kind of center ourselves and draw inward a little bit. So take a deep breath in. And out. And in. And out. And in. And out. So I'm going to describe a scene here, if you like. This is done best outside on a warm, cloudless, moonless night, but we'll do it here in our imagination. So make yourself comfortable, listen to my voice, try and tune out everything else. What we're going to do is visualize an ascent to the one, the Neoplatonic one. So begin in your mind, looking around you at your surroundings, at the plants, the trees, the houses, or whatever else is in sight. Imagine their solidity and materiality, but also the myriad physical processes taking place in them, which will cause all these things, even the rocks, to decay eventually. The animals are breathing, digesting, the plants are taking in moisture, nutrients, they're building themselves up, but they're also slowly decaying. Everything is changing, the rocks, the rivers, the trees, the buildings, everything is in a continual state of flux. This is the material world in which we spend most of our time, in which we live. Now shift your gaze upward into the air, above the tops of the trees, and above the clouds if any are visible, but not so high as the stars. Think about the blanket of air surrounding the entire earth with a continuous fluid, a breath spirit that enters into the depths of every plant and animal. The plants breathing in carbon dioxide and out oxygen, the animals breathing in oxygen and out carbon dioxide, all of us connected together by this breath spirit that we all share. All living things on the planet share this. This is a symbol for the world soul, which surrounds and connects all of us, bringing life to all of us. This oxygen goes into your lungs and through them into your blood and thence into every cell of your body. This all permeating air not only envelops, but also connects all living things. Now shift your attention upward to the stars. Move upward through the planetary spheres, the sphere of the moon, the sphere of Venus, who brings us love and pleasure, the sphere of the sun, which is especially important in the Platonic tradition as a symbol of the ineffable one and of Apollo, through the sphere of Mars, who brings us competition, strength, courage, the sphere of Jupiter, who brings us authority, the sphere of Saturn, who brings us wisdom and patience. Through these moving spheres, we move up into the sphere of the stars, the permanent stars. Set aside any astronomical knowledge you might have and admire the beauty of these fiery points of light. They've been there forever, and your ancestors gazed on them in wonder as you do now. They are perfect points separated by vast, impassable voids, giving each a perfect identity. They are not independent, for they are related to each other, creating eternal forms that are as evocative for us as they were for our ancestors. Contemplate them, trace out their patterns. These stars represent the Platonic forms, perfect in their eternity and in their relationship to each other. This is the realm of the gods, these shining beings, these perfect beings out in eternity. Finally, project your attention into the black void beyond the stars, the perfect silence and invisibility out of which have emanated the stars and all else. This may take some mental effort, but focus on the black sky behind the stars. Rest for a while in the abyss, the perfect simplicity and infinity of the one. All things merged together, no distinctions, everything united. Rest a while in this. Feel your own unification. Feel yourself as an integrated being and as a being united with everything in the world, from the physical level up through the level of the world soul, through the level of the world mind, and into the inexpressible one. And rest in this for a moment or two and feel this energy of unity, of permanence, of peace in you for a few moments. After you have meditated on the void, on the ineffable one, and achieved a state of peace, calm, and tranquility, we can begin our descent. So in the void, begin to notice the faintest stars. Don't strain to see them, but just let them slowly emerge out of the void. The tiniest points of light that appear at the edge of your attention. You're not sure they're there, and then slowly you become sure that they are there. You are witnessing the emergence of the ideas and the Platonic forms from the One. Continue to broaden your attention to take in more of the starry firmament, and try to hold the whole sky in your awareness. Know that these beings of light are the causes of everything. Though motionless in their heaven, they are the governors of the cosmos. Next, let your attention descend into the atmosphere, the all-pervasive spirit, moving in currents large and small to connect the earth into one living organism. Think about the air moving through all living things, keeping them alive, but also creating the weather that drives natural processes. Feel your connection with all other living things and with the earth itself. Finally, return your attention to the physical things around you, but experience them as emanations and effects produced by all the levels above you. The trees, the rocks, the grass, the houses, the people, the other animals, everything in the world around us. You can open your eyes whenever you like. When you finish this practice and get up, try to take with you the feeling of the interconnectedness of all things, both horizontally to other things on the same level, and vertically as emanations of the One. That completes the exercise.
Thank you so much for this practice.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's a very good way for a reader of your book to feel what was your attempt in the book and to help to understand by the experience what we can do. And
I think that's important, that we experience it. I mean, that, in my sense, is one of the important differences between ancient philosophy and many modern, both religious and philosophical traditions, is experience. It's based on direct experience of the divine.
I wish I could have learned philosophy in France like that. The university would have been very different.
I think, well, that's an interesting question. You know, Pierre Hadot is one of the great movers in this area, and I certainly would have loved to have studied philosophy under him.
Yes.
He's unfortunately passed now.
He was one of the few.
Yes, one of the few.
Because the establishment in Europe is very strong and immobile. So thank you very much for this exchange, this conversation about your books and your work. I am sure we will be able to speak again and to see what we can do for other courses on the Theurgia University to go further with Theurgy, with Ascent with Love or Ascent of Love, as you said, talk about the Fidele d'Amore and more.
Yes.
So thank you very much for this conversation today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it.